Can we all just get along? Yes, we can, says Angela Oh, a Zen Buddhist priest who is dedicated to resolving conflicts. She'll explain why next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. What could be the future of race relations in the United States? Angela Oh, a civil rights lawyer, a peace and justice advocate, and a Zen Buddhist priest, understands the importance of building bridges. Welcome to the show, Angela.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Take us back to your civil rights law days. How did you get into it, and what was your biggest experience or challenge?
Well, I don't have to take you back very far since I'm still in it. And I was, I think, inspired really as a graduate student when I was doing my public health education work at UCLA. And at that time, it wasn't civil rights so much, but it was something about basic human dignity and the ability to have work that was meaningful and safe. At that time, I was very involved with community-based health education. I did a lot of work with people who worked in environments that were highly toxic or hazardous. And at the time, there had been no law passed in the state of California that allowed working people to know what kinds of hazardous materials they were working with day to day. So we passed a piece of legislation called the Right to Know law. And that's how I started getting involved in what you could call civil rights.
Tell us about the period of the LA riots. How did you get as prominently involved in those as you were?
In 1992, when LA imploded, you know, it's referred to as the LA riots of 92. It's also referred to as a rebellion, civil disobedience. This was a time when we were, as a country, in the midst of a recession. Nobody was calling it a recession. It was an economic downturn. And we had double-digit unemployment. The urban centers across the country were hit hard. LA definitely was hit hard. You also had a very tenuous police-community relationship. Things had been bad in '65. Things imploded. And now in '92, you had a series of events that culminated in the videotaped beating of Rodney King, and then the subsequent trial of the officers who were actively involved in the beating, not of those who were standing around and watching. And when those verdicts came back not guilty, Los Angeles imploded and gave us the worst civil disaster of modern history in this country. Thousands of small family-owned businesses were destroyed by looting, arson, just general, destruction of property. And then you also had a law enforcement department, the LAPD, that really didn't know how to respond. But the factors that contributed were multi-faceted, because you had the economic conditions, you had the poor police-community relations, you had a situation where investment was happening very, very readily in the financial centers, but just a few miles away, poverty was really starting to show in terms of people who could not find work, who wanted work, people who had very negative encounters with law enforcement, a media apparatus that really didn't report on the things that were happening. And on top of it all, you had a demographic change that was happening in Los Angeles that I think sort of preceded what we're seeing now at a national level. The country is going to shift in terms of its demographic profile. It's already started shifting in many places. Los Angeles was one of the precursor locations.
So it sounds like, given those circumstances, you weren't that surprised by what happened. But
I wasn't.
But
that's true.
Did you expect it to be as widespread and destructive as it was?
You know, no one would expect that kind of widespread destruction. It was over $1 billion worth of just property damage, not counting the emotional toll that was taken by families directly affected by the destruction, but also those who just watched what happened. And so it was a very sobering time. I am an ethnic Korean American woman born and raised in LA. And my training happened to be by the time 1992 came, I was a trial lawyer. And I was working in a small practice in downtown LA. I was very active in the Korean American community. I was active in the civil rights community, the civil liberties community. I had a history of being engaged with women's issues. So I was very involved in the local community as well as in the organized bar. And prior to Mr. King's verdicts, the beating case verdicts coming out, there had been another case. It was People v. Sunja-doo. And there was a young African-American child, Latasha Harlins, who had been shot and killed. And that trial resulted in a voluntary manslaughter verdict with no prison time. Okay, when the judge pronounced the sentence, there was no prison time. And that really shocked and upset members of the African-American community who were very focused on the fact that a 15-year-old child had been shot in a store owned by an ethnic Korean immigrant family. I happen to know the trial lawyer who defended Mrs. Doo, and he's an African-American lawyer who is very prominent in the bar as a criminal defense lawyer, Charlie Lloyd. Because of that case, Mr. Lloyd's reputation in his own community suffered tremendously. He ended up closing his practice ultimately. But that case preceded the police officer's case involving Mr. King. And the community at that time was being asked to wait. The justice system will work. Give it a chance. So you understand the build to April 29, 1992, when the not guilty verdicts, not hung jury, not guilty verdicts were pronounced in the state's case, which resulted in the reaction that people refer to now as the 1992 riots in LA.
So that situation propelled you to national attention and national service. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So because of my role just really in the community at that time, when Ted Koppel came along and wanted to do an interview in Los Angeles with people from the communities that he perceived to be most directly affected, he called on myself and the president of the Korean American Bar at the time. I was the incoming president. The president at the time, John Lim, was called, and he was not comfortable speaking to the media, and he asked me to step forward. So I did, and in the conversation with Mr. Koppel that ran on a show that I didn't even watch in those days, Nightline, ended up really bringing a tremendous amount of attention to Los Angeles, and I became sort of a source for many media people. There weren't that many people in the mainstream media who could talk about what had happened or even know where to go to find people who could talk about what happened, because frankly, it wasn't something that anyone paid attention to. There was no diversity really in the mainstream network television and radio outlets. People who did have some knowledge of what was happening around tensions specifically around Black community and Korean immigrant community were people that had been trying to change the profile of businesses that were owned by small immigrant Korean families. In South Los Angeles, you know, it had once been very much a Jewish business owner's environment. Then it went to Chinese. Then it went to Koreans. And, you know, immigrants come to the country with no resources, no credit history, no banking relationships, but they have to live. And there was an ability for them to buy into small businesses. Unfortunately, these were businesses that were mostly liquor stores. And liquor stores were perceived and are sometimes very, very bad for the health and well-being of a community. It happened to coincide at a time when the black community was having its own consciousness raised about why is it that we are not being able to get employed. We want to work, we have the ability to work, we can't find work. Why is it that these foreigners are occupying space that represents the only economic development in our community? Why is it that these foreigners who own these small economic engines also are selling to us products that are dangerous for our health and well-being? Why is it that they're not speaking English? Where is it that they're getting the money? All of these kinds of questions were percolating, and behind the antipathy that was ultimately expressed when the implosion and reaction to the verdicts came out in April of 1992. Koreans, they didn't understand. I mean, they knew there was this trial going on, and if you asked, most of them would say it was terrible what the police did to this man, but they had no idea that the anger and the resentment would turn to them. This was my first lesson in understanding we live in the same space, but we live in parallel universes. So you had the black community seeing reality as their lived experience. You had the Korean immigrant community seeing reality as their lived experience in the same space at the same time. But the understanding was completely different. They could have been across the state from one another. But then you had a system that broke down, and in my opinion it did, because of the perfect storm of inexperience on the bench and media and a public that doesn't understand the limits of the law. The law is not the place where race relations is going to get worked out. It simply is not. The only way out is education, to set aside the ignorance that most of us carry around about people who are different from ourselves.
How did your White House experience affect you? Sometimes people are inspired to seek other offices, political office at the national level perhaps. How were you affected?
Initially, it was incredible to be in that kind of a space, to see how the most powerful political office in the world operates, and the resources that are available, and the way in which getting tasks completed can be done so effectively and so smartly. But for myself, given the person that I am, I knew this was not the space that I wanted to be in. I very quickly realized that this is a space where power attracts a certain kind of energy, and it's a kind of energy that I found not healthy for me. Other people may be very much, I mean, it's seductive. It's a seductive environment. We say we don't have royalty. I've been to 2 state dinners. We have royalty, right? I have seen what it is like to sit in a room of 100, 120 people with the heads of state side by side, with all of the cabinet secretaries, with special guests who are invited, and how the program works twice. It's beautiful on one level. It's unfortunate that more people can't have that kind of experience because it's breathtaking. On the other hand, to stay in that kind of environment is not real as to who the people in this country are and what they need from the leadership. That is a exercise in hospitality, but then you have to do the work. And at the level of the White House, there are so many levels of concern and analysis that have to go on simultaneously, and so many fronts on which messaging has to be shaped in order to be heard by the receiver. A lot of energy goes in this direction of having to strategize every moment. It wasn't my environment, I knew it. And so I went back to what I do right now, learning how to bring people together. And you know, it seems like it's such a simple thing to do, but depending on the environment in which you're working, it can become very complicated. So For me, I understood that politics, given the influence of money and given the influence of certain personalities and egos, was not my place. It was going to be a lot of energy expenditure for very little impact on changing conditions, the material conditions of people's lives. And in what I do today, I feel like I really help people. And that's ultimately what I care about.
Somewhere along the way you became a Zen Buddhist priest. Was that something you had planned and thought about for some time, or did it just happen?
Nobody plans to do, well, I shouldn't say nobody. So in the Zen tradition, of course, you know, it's something that is part of my karma. I'm supposed to walk this path. It's very clear to me. When I stay on this path, things open. So it was during the race initiative that I asked the White House to go to a place where the majority population is not European. And the only place that's part of the US that's accessible fairly readily from the continent was Hawaii. I wanted to see if our packaging really was the issue, really. So I was given permission to go, but it was to be done as an individual, one of 7 members, to go and convene and have conversations and report back. So I did that. And what I learned was that human beings are human beings are human beings. So in that space, I met journalists, I met people of the faith community, I met people who were part of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, I met people who were in mixed race, mixed ethnic homes, and I met a Zen master. And that conversation was quite eye-opening, heart-opening, I would say. And it ended up, not by design, but just by circumstance, that I was to go back to Hawaii several times more in the following 2 years, because I was part of a women's leadership group that was going to convene a conference at the turn of the century. And Honolulu was the site where it was going to happen, so I had to go back for planning meetings. I didn't have a particular affinity for Hawaii. So I went back, and each time I met with the teacher in that small monastery. And over time, I realized that the path I was walking was taking me in a different direction.
Well, now you've accumulated all of this experience, and as you examine the race relations issue in the United States and looking forward, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? What can we actively do to address this question? Because in some respects, it seems to be more difficult today than at many times in the past.
So I find myself being optimistic when I'm with young people who are sincere in asking what they can do from where they are, wherever that may be. And I meet with young people in all kinds of environments, and not just young people in universities anymore. For a while it was just in university settings, but one of the places where I do the Zen training, the meditation instruction, is in the criminal courts with people who have been found guilty of crimes, but they're being given a chance by the courts to earn a probationary sentence or to have their charges dismissed, because these are individuals who are in nonviolent, first-time offender situations. And it's very gratifying to meet some of these individuals who recognize that the path that they were on was simply a huge mistake, and they're very ready to switch gears. And this is a tool that they welcome and embrace as a way to manage the chaos in their lives at the moment. When I meet young people in universities who are ready to take their studies and their talents and their gifts in a direction of serving humanity in a broader sense, not just concerns about my career, my job, my trajectory, but my job, my work in connection with what the impact will be in the world. When I work with foster young adults who have been in a system that is very, very notorious for abuse, everything from human trafficking to sexual assault to just basic betrayal of love and trust, who are now coming into adulthood, being cut off from all of their support networks, but needing a way to find a stable path to walk as they navigate what their adult life will be. So in all of these places, I find inspiration because all of them have different race and ethnic backgrounds, okay? When I become disappointed and more pessimistic is when I hear people engaged in a discourse that's about whose pain is worse and whose suffering is deeper. We all suffer and we all have that pain somewhere. So the real work is about understanding that we're not going to correct in one generation. It's going to take several. And we are not going to displace the human tendency to be guarded and to not trust and to be doubtful and to be suspicious. We're not going to change that overnight, but we can train to be better as human beings. Each one of us can. It's not about, being the perfect person, but it's about what it takes in the effort and the process of trying to be that, right? In how we live our lives.
If you were giving advice to the President of the United States on this issue, what would be the most important suggestion you'd make about changing the situation, making a difference on the issue of race relations?
I guess what I would say is to not lose the capacity for kindness and for confidence that there are people in this society that will not be moved by these events that occur that really represent intolerance and hatred and bigotry. That kind of language, it's part of our human dialogue. Living is a dialectic process. And so for this president, I would say do the best you can in the office that you hold now. Get out. You're young. Do much, much more with your life. You know where the problems are and you know how they manifest. So just pick a spot, because there are so many places from which this problem can be addressed. He's in the best position to just pick a spot. And I don't mean go back to Harvard, and teach in constitutional law. Pick a spot where you can really use all of the relationships that you've made. You've had a chance to meet some of the most dedicated people who, in their own way, are dealing with race. Talking about race or dealing specifically with race relations is, in my opinion, not very helpful, because it's everybody has an opinion and they're entitled to it. But if you pick an industry or you pick a business setting or you pick a teaching setting or a community-based NGO setting, do the best you can to be aware of all of the things that we know are the manifestations of bigotry today. Implicit bias is a huge issue right now. You know about it, right? So when you walk into a space, pay attention. Do that environmental scan, and you're really smart. So make the changes that have to be made. Don't be a coward about it. All of us, we are confronted with situations in life where we know the right thing to do. But for whatever reason, we don't do the right thing. Usually there's no bravery left, right? There's no willingness to step into the unknown. People are so afraid of the unknown, but why? The unknown could be the most incredible thing. It holds the most potential, the most possibility for the most incredible things to happen. But for some reason, most people want to stay with what they know. Even if it's miserable, they would rather stay with what they know than step into the unknown. But in the 21st century, we must have capacity to step into the unknown.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Angela Oh.
Thank you.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.